If you look at a world map, what lights up flashing red is the so-called Tornado Alley of the United States.
So how is a tornado formed?
That's a really good question. And we don't actually know all of the gory details, but in principle, what happens is we have rotation that gets developed at the ground, and then we have a thunderstorm that's kind of overhead of that ground-based rotation. And what happens is the rotation that's below is sucked into the middle and pulled upward, very similar to an ice skater. As she pulls her arms in, she spins faster. The same principle applies to a tornado. Now, some questions surrounding that is like, where does that ground-based rotation come from in the first place? Why is it only there sometimes? And those are things that we're answering right now, we're hoping to answer.
Why does it seem to be only in certain places, only at certain times?
If you look at a world map of, I don't know if this can be found on the internet easily, but somewhere you can probably find a map that shows the distribution of tornadoes worldwide. And what lights up flashing red is the so-called Tornado Alley of the United States, roughly from Texas northward up to the Dakotas and eastward to roughly the Mississippi River. There's also an extension that extends east of the Mississippi into the southeastern United States.
And that has to do with the physical geographic configuration of that part of the country. We have a warm, moist source for air coming up from the Gulf of Mexico. We have elevated terrain towards the west. That includes both the Colorado Rockies. So we get low pressure systems developing on the eastern side of those Colorado Rockies, which promote southerly winds, which suck up that warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico. And then further to the southwest, we have a geographic feature called the Mexican Plateau, which advects or moves air from the southwest towards the northeast, which trajectory-wise takes it up over the Central Plains area, and that contributes to the formation of a feature known as the dry line. And the dry line is a known source for forming storms in the first place. And then that air also actually contributes to a stable layer immediately above the ground, which allows for the surface conditions to become really juicy and moist and wet and warm, and eventually, once it gets warm enough, we can have explosive thunderstorm development. So without that stable layer above, we would see more modest kind of trickling of intermediate type thunderstorms. When we look at specific locations, like a specific town or a specific area near a mountain, for example, we do know that in some cases, depending on the overall larger scale environment, we can locally contribute to environments that are more favorable for tornado formation because of specific geographic features that exist at an exact location. So for example, there are certain river valleys that are known to change the winds in a manner that actually creates tornadoes more efficiently than if those river valleys weren't there, for example. Similarly, there's some terrain features, for example, in Alabama, where we tend to see enhanced tornado formation on one side or the other side of a topographic feature. And again, we relate that to local modification, primarily of wind direction and wind speed, that for basically a short time frame as a storm is passing over it, locally enhances the environmental conditions and essentially tips the scale toward a scenario that's more favorable for tornadoes than if that terrain feature weren't there in the first place.
When you talk about like terrain features, right? Like the first thing, are we talking about like, okay, we built this row of houses in a way that funnels the wind? Are we talking about like golf courses, or like we've tunneled into the side of a mountain or something? Like what do you mean by like topographical features?
So I basically mean kind of the natural features in the land. So hills and valleys, and to a degree some smaller mountains. And now if you have a really large mountain, typically that's not going to be favorable for a tornado to survive. It's not going to be able to go up and over. But certain smaller scale hills and escarpments or valleys are known to locally modify the direction and speed of winds in that sense.
So it's not like Steve built a house at the end of a cul-de-sac and now we've got tornadoes here because he didn't build it the way everybody else did or something.
That's right. Although with that in mind, I am participating in some work with a civil engineer where we're looking at how individual houses and buildings modify tornadoes as tornadoes are approaching them. And then similarly, like if you were to destroy those buildings by the tornado, how does that then impact the tornado as it moves on further in its life? So there are actual physical effects that are associated with individual buildings too, but it's not gonna probably make the difference of whether or not a tornado forms in the first place. But when you get a bunch of buildings together in certain block-like construction configurations, it may end up actually affecting the tornado either for good or for bad.
We could have like tornado-proof buildings. Or like, hey, build this thing here, and it's going to stop the tornado or deflect it or something like that.
Possibly in the future, you know.
Just to kind of reiterate, it's not the weather, it's the weather and that specific geographical feature of the land.
That's generally correct, yeah.
Climate change, has that affected them in the sense of their strength? There's more of them, they're in different places, or...
So in a very traditional sense, Tornado Alley, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, has always been the mecca for tornadoes in the U.S. and in the world. And it still is. I don't want to slight them from that. But we are seeing a significant decline in the number of tornadoes in that part of the country. And we think that's primarily driven by drought and the fact that in a climate change scenario, we're increasing the robustness of the hydrological cycle. And we tend to be seeing more drought in areas like Texas and Oklahoma and Kansas. And where you have drought, you have dry conditions, you have dry soils. And that's going to be negatively impacting the ability of the atmosphere to actually produce a tornado. So we do see a little bit of a decline in the number of tornadoes in those traditional states, particularly in the climatologically most active months of the year, primarily like late April or early, well, all of May basically, and into early June. Now, to compensate for that, what we are seeing is an increase in the number of tornadoes in southeastern states of the United States. And this is kind of the traditional Dixie Alley that people refer to. So we're looking at Mississippi and Alabama into Georgia and Tennessee. And I don't like to call it a shift because it's not like a continuous thing. It's not like the tornadoes are kind of like starting here and they're edging this way, but instead it's kind of like a reallocation. Like we're kind of reducing the numbers here, but we're adding to the numbers here in a sort of different spatial sense. And those tornadoes are occurring during the cold season. So January, February, March, times of year when we as people tend to not think about tornadoes as being overly important because it's wintertime, right? But the link there is retaining heat in the Gulf of Mexico and then the conflict with the cold air that still is generated in polar latitudes. When you have these really strong cold fronts come through, you have really cold air aloft, and then you generate these very strong and dynamically driven low pressure systems. So these are basically your everyday lows, like where you have a cold front and a warm front and drive our everyday weather. In this climate change scenario, those become almost a little bit more robust because we have more heat and more energy stored up in the Gulf of Mexico to contribute to moving on land as that large-scale low-pressure system is intensifying. And then that can cause destabilization and can cause these really deep low pressures that ultimately drive large-scale environmental conditions that are favorable for tornadoes.